Chapter 12 is mathematics and politics. So some might be a little bit surprised, or maybe a lot of people are not surprised that there's quite a bit of mathematics involved in politics, particularly when it comes to voting and representation. So the first thing we cover in this section is the majority rule. So the majority rule is what it sounds like. It's the method of voting whereby the candidate or choice that receives 50% or more of the votes wins the election. So this would be a choice like a choice for a law, whether or not to adopt an amendment to a constitution or something, or to vote for a candidate for office. And the choice for the individual, the candidate that has 50% or more of the votes in the election wins that election. It's one of the most simple types of election rules that we can adopt. It's probably one of the most familiar as well. So it can be used in elections with two or more choices, but for most of the examples we consider, we'll just see two choices. And that's what the book limits to as well. But what we will consider are elections with other rules that we'll use to determine them with more than one candidate in other examples. So the majority rule satisfies three pretty important properties. The first is that every vote has the same weight. In other words, no person's vote counts more than anybody else's. There's symmetry between the candidates. If we reversed all the results, then the winner would become the loser and the loser would become the winner. This is particularly clear if we're just thinking about an election between two candidates. And then if a vote for the loser were changed to a vote for the winner, the outcome of the election would not be changed. So if you kind of wrap your head around that one, it should make sense. If we took a vote from the loser and gave it to the winner, it should propel the winner even further into a winning position. So again, with two candidates, that's a pretty easy concept to see for the majority rule. So moving right into probably one of the most famous elections in the country, or at least in the country, possibly in the world, the U.S. presidential election. The U.S. presidential election is actually decided by majority rule among the electoral college, so among the electoral votes that each candidate receives. So each state has a certain number of electoral college votes, and that number of electoral college votes matches the number of representatives that each state has. And roughly each state is supposed to have, approximately an equal representation per person for the representatives in Congress, which also makes up their electoral votes. So each state should have a roughly equal electoral vote representation per person. And we'll see that later in chapter or section 12B, where that may or may not be happening in certain cases. So anyway, the electoral college is really where the presidential election is determined. So when you cast a vote for the president in your state, you're actually casting a vote for the state's electors. So down below, we're going to consider the 2016 election between Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton. And, had you voted in that election in 2016, and then perhaps you voted for Donald Trump, then what you were actually voting for was you're putting forth a vote in your state to elect to choose the state electors that would cast the state's electoral votes for Trump. Okay. Or vice versa. If you voted for Clinton, you were voting to elect, or you're voting to choose the electors that represented Hillary Clinton for that state. So once the votes in each state are counted, the electors for the state are determined. So each state has a decision as to how they're going to determine who wins the state's electoral votes. Most states use a winner-take-all method, and this is mentioned down here. A couple of states do things that are slightly different. Nebraska and Maine have ways of breaking up their electoral college votes among their districts, but for the most part, the other 48 states use the winner-take-all method. In other words, the candidate who has the most votes within the state receives all that state's electoral college votes. Now, once the electoral votes for each state are decided, then the electors go to Congress, DC, and then they cast the electoral votes from each state, and then those votes are all totaled. The candidate with the majority of these electoral votes wins the presidential election. So hopefully that's fairly clear. So the popular vote, as it's listed above here, really has no consequential effect on the electoral vote, at least no direct effect. So what we saw in the 2016 election was something we've seen previously in elections as well. I think the 2000 election, we had a situation where the popular vote was lost by the candidate that won the electoral vote. So nonetheless, let's have a look down here at this example from 2016. These are roughly the totals from the 2016 presidential election. So they ask us to determine the margins of victory in both absolute and relative terms for the popular vote and the electoral vote. So let's deal with the popular vote first, because this is curious enough, right? What we see in the table are Donald Trump's popular, votes from all people in the country, right? In general, he received 62.9 million votes approximately. Hillary Clinton received 65.8 votes roughly from all the people from all voters in the US who participated in the election. And what we see is that Trump won 306 electoral votes and Clinton won 232 electoral votes. So let's determine those margins of victory real quick. So first off, we can see the difference between the two in the popular vote. So when we consider the popular vote here first, we see that Clinton won 2.8 or 2,868,686 more popular votes than Trump did. So yes, we can see that even from the table alone, that Hillary's 65 million beats Donald Trump's 62 million in the popular vote. By percentage, Clinton won about 48.52% of the popular vote. I took this number and divided it by the total to get her percentage. And Donald Trump won 46.41%. I took his popular vote count and divided it by the total. Now let's note the margin of victory here. That would be the difference between these two percentages in percentage points. So it looks like Hillary Clinton won about 2.1% more of the popular vote than Donald Trump did. That's really just the difference between these two numbers. So that's essentially one way of looking at the relative margin of victory in this case. So let's keep one thing in mind. The popular vote, neither candidate won the majority of the popular vote, right? Well, you might say, how's that possible? We had two main candidates and one of them won. Well, for one thing, this is the popular vote, which doesn't actually determine the election for the president. And the other thing is this, the reason that no candidate got a majority was in part because there were other candidates that were involved. So 6.8 million votes approximately were cast for other candidates, which was enough to take away the popular majority from any candidate. Now, even had one of these candidates won the popular majority, it still would not have affected the Electoral College vote, at least not directly. Okay, so let's look on the other hand at what happened in the electoral vote. So Trump won 306 electoral votes to Hillary Clinton's 232. So he won 74 more electoral college votes than Clinton did. So clearly that puts him ahead of Clinton in that case. Now, as a percentage, Trump won 56.88%. This is approximate. This is 306 divided by 538 to get that percentage. So he won 56.88% of the Electoral College votes, whereas Clinton won 43.12% of the Electoral College votes. And as I said before, the presidential election is determined by the winner, whoever has the majority of the Electoral College votes. And in this case, Trump won 56.88%, and that's greater than 50%. So by the majority rule in the Electoral College, Trump won that election. Now, there are some questions as to, how it can make sense that, Clinton only won 43.12% of the Electoral College votes, but won 48.52% of the popular vote, which is more than what Trump won in the popular vote. And the reason that happened is, we have states that have, something like maybe California. I think California was probably overwhelmingly in Clinton's favor, but California has a limited number of electoral college votes. So it doesn't matter how much Californians preferred Clinton or people in New York preferred Clinton. California and New York can only give so many electoral college votes towards the election. So Trump was able to more or less strategically win more electoral college votes, even though perhaps, maybe he wasn't popularly favored in this election, though it might be hard to say. It is relatively close in the popular vote. It's only 2 million off, just a couple percent apart. So, that's maybe a judgment call. So something about this doesn't seem, totally fair, right? The only thing that that a candidate needs to win here is the electoral college vote, and the candidate only needs to get a majority of these 538 votes. So that turns out to be half of 538 is 269 votes. So to get over a majority, a candidate has to win 270 of the votes in the electoral college. So that's really the line that most candidates for presidential elections will focus on. They're just trying to get 270 electoral college votes, because that'll push them over the majority of the 538 total electoral college votes. And that'll leave, if one candidate had 270, then the other candidate would have 268. And then, the candidate with 270 would thereby win. So that's really what these things come down to. And that's why one candidate can win the popular vote and not the electoral vote. So I would say that there's some lack of reasonable representation here, that if we continue to have candidates that lose the popular vote but win the electoral vote, then there must be something wrong, or something that we could at least change about the system. And that's to some degree a little bit what the rest of this chapter is about. But really, it's more of an exploration of how we can get better voter satisfaction in general, in all cases. So before we get to that, I'll just mention another concept from the book, and that's a supermajority. Supermajorities are not really dealt with in a common situation. I think maybe in, boards for corporations or corporate bodies, they might use supermajority voting for certain decisions. For one thing, in the Senate can be a bill in the Senate can be filibustered. In other words, sort of continuously debated in such a way that it stops the bill from being voted on. That's a filibuster. The Senate can stop a filibuster by a process called cloture. And cloture is where a supermajority, which is, by the way, any percentage that's higher than 50%, in this case, a supermajority of 60% or more of senators vote to end a filibuster, then the bill can go on to debate. So we hear a lot about the filibuster and how to overcome it. That is the way to do it, if we're going to allow a filibuster to even exist. So let's move on to elections with more than two choices. Okay, so it was nice to consider two choices for majority rule elections just to get introduced, but I think that most races are more interesting with more than two candidates, right? And I think that probably in general we'll get greater voter satisfaction if we have more than two candidates to choose from, and they're all viable, right? So a lot of the problems that we have in our current elections is that we generally have it down to two candidates, one of those two of which is going to win, and we can't really vote for a third or fourth candidate. So let's see why those sorts of things might happen, right? So let's look at this table here. This is a hypothetical Senate race, maybe between three different candidates. It was somehow competitive among three candidates. So we look, nobody wins the majority here. So we can't use, if we're using majority rule, then we don't have a majority winner here. So this election is sort of undecided in this situation. What we tend to do, in the way that state elections work for the state electors for the presidential election, is that we have winner take all. In this case, had this been a presidential election in your state, then Calderon would have won 38% of the vote. Calderon would have the most vote, the highest percentage of all votes cast, and Calderon would win the election, or win the state's electors, and that would go to their count in the electoral college. But getting back to the fact that this is a Senate race, that's the plurality format, right? So if we were just to use the plurality format, the simplest winner-take-all format for this Senate race, then Calderon wins the Senate race with 38% of the vote. But consider the outcome, in terms of voter satisfaction. 35 plus 27% of the voters did not support Calderon. That was not their choice, right? They preferred, it looks like that's 62% of voters would rather have not had Calderon as their senator, right? Nonetheless, here they are with them. So, maybe a better way to go about doing this is to use a runoff election. So this is yet another method we might use. In a runoff election, we have a second election between the top two candidates. This is a single runoff election because we have the first election to decide who the top two candidates are. That's Calderon and Shihab. And then we're going to have another election between the top two. So this is maybe a reasonable way to do this. And in this case, we'd be choosing between Calderon and Shihab in another election, and then we could really see how many of Bauer's voters supported one of Calderon or Shihab, one way or the other. Okay, but since we're going to have, multiple elections can be kind of a pain, right? Most people go to vote once a year or once every couple of years, or once every 4 years, maybe even. I think me dial that back. Most of the time, we only have an election every 2 years. So most people vote once every 2 years, and a lot of people really only vote once every 4 years when the presidential election comes around. So really, we just want to vote one time. Well, we can capture the effect of a runoff election through a ballot that we can put more information into. So that's our next thought here. So a preference ballot or a preference schedule for a ballot. So we need to know voters' second choice or even third or fourth choice preferences for candidates, right? So rather than going back for a second election, our ballot could look like this. We could, for this hypothetical Senate race between these three candidates, we could use a number of 1 through 3, 1 being the most preferred to 3 being the least preferred. And then we could say, okay, well, on my ballot, I can now say my most preferred candidate. I'm a Shihab voter, so I'm voting for Shihab. I don't like Calderon. My second choice is Bowers, and my third choice is Calderon. So that is one way that I might fill this ballot out, right? So you could imagine maybe in a current election you might have on your mind, where you have more than 2 candidates for an office. You might think how you'd want to vote for somebody who might not be as viable as your first place candidate, because maybe they're a third party, they're not Democrat or Republican. However, they're your favorite. You could rank them and say, okay, here's my favorite, even if they're viable or not. What will happen is this method of counting the votes, well, once my candidate is no longer valid or viable, this vote will be erased, and then my vote will become my second choice. So once Shihab is no longer a viable candidate, now Bowers is the candidate I'm voting for. So I'm still able to support the candidate I'd rather have in place of Calderon. So, and that's how a ranked choice ballot would work. We're going to get into the details of how we'll count up the results of one of these preference schedules, and we're going to see that down below. So this could be filled out any number of ways. There's one way. We could also maybe do I'm a Shihab, then Calderon, then Bowers voter, right? Lots of different ways we can rank these candidates, and we could have more than 3 candidates, and we could rank them however we like. So that's just a sample of what the ballot might be like. So let's see what the results could look like. Right, so once all these things are tallied, then, and this is again for the same race, Calderon versus Shihab versus Bowers for that Senate race. And what we have is this: we have a first choice, second choice, and third choice rows. And what this is just a preference arrangement. So these are voters that preferred Calderon number 1, then Shihab as their second choice, then Bowers as their third choice. So I think in my initial voting, I said I want Shihab, then Bowers, then Calderon. Perhaps this is on this list. Oh, it actually isn't. And so, this table is hypothetical. There could be a third column where there are Shihab, Bowers, Calderon voters in that order down this column. And we could have that in there, and it would have a count of people that voted that way, right? Another set of people that, or the number of votes that, the number of ballots that had that type of preference on it. So to keep things simple, we don't have every arrangement on here, though most elections would involve every arrangement. This is to keep it simple so we can figure out who wins this election, right? So let's look at these results for just a moment, and then we're really going to dig into an example with them. It's a little bit hard to tell up front who should win this election, right? So it seems like Calderon has 320 first choice votes. Then Shihab has 330 first choice votes. And Bowers actually has two arrangements here, right? So these are voters that voted Bowers, Calderon, Shihab. Those numbers would look like this. It would be 1 for Bowers, 2 for Calderon, and 3 for Shihab. That would be the way that one of these votes would come about. And if I submitted this ballot right here, it would be one of the votes of this 175. Right, so that's to link your ballot to the results. So of course, the results would be counted up by machine, by election officials, and all of that will be worked out, as it normally is. We wouldn't have to deal with all the counting part of it. You would just get to see the results of it all. So in this case, and this is another set of voters, these voters on the right here are different than the voters on the left, because the voters in the rightmost column preferred Shihab as their second candidate and Calderon as their, and versus those who had Calderon as their second candidate. Right, so they switched the order of Calderon and Shihab. So it's really hard to tell just looking at these results who should win this election. And we have different methods to count these things up. Now, this would all be set. We would have chosen a method going into the election beforehand. Of course, we're not just going to, as election officials, just randomly apply whatever rule we feel like we should to decide who wins this election. So, but what we should do is explore some of the methods that can be applied to see who actually wins this. So let's go to the next page and do that. Well, at least we'll learn some of these methods first. So we've already seen the plurality method. This is the candidate with the most first place votes. Okay. And we'll apply that to that table in the next example. And then there's the single runoff election. The single runoff is where we narrow it down to 2 candidates, the top 2, right? And then we can see who has the most votes after we've done that. And this is all done instantly with the ranked ballot schedule that we've got. And I'll show you how to do that from the table on the previous page in our next example. There are 3 other ways we can do this. There's another one called the sequential runoff. And what the sequential runoff does is it eliminates the candidate with the fewest number of first place votes, and it moves their voters up to the remaining candidates. So this is where I was talking about a viable candidate is now, once your first choice candidate is no longer viable, in other words, removed in the sequential runoff process, then your second choice applies to, it becomes your vote. And then your votes go to that second choice. And if your second choice becomes non-viable and nobody's won yet, then your third choice will go on. And this repeats until one candidate earns a majority of the votes and wins the election. So we'll see this in an example. It's hard to sort of wrap your mind around it until you see it in action. Another one is a point system. So this would assign maybe the most points for a candidate with first place votes, 1 point fewer for second place votes, and then 1 point fewer for third place votes, another point fewer for fourth place votes, and so on down the line. We'll do this process as well. The candidate with the most points would win. And then lastly, we do a pairwise comparison method, or we could use a pairwise comparison method. And in this situation, you pit each candidate against every other candidate individually. And then the candidate who beats every other candidate individually in pairwise races, one-on-one, wins the election. So let's see how to do all of these things. So we'll go now to that example using all of these. So this is our same table that we dealt with initially. And what we've got is 5 different methods that we want to use to determine the winner of this 3-way Senate race. And these are the results of our elections, right? These are this is the rankings. This is the first, second, third choice ranking, and 320 people ranked the candidates in this manner, right? Just to reiterate what was happening there. 330 candidates ranked the candidates, or sorry, 330 voters ranked the candidates in this order: Shahab, Calderon, Bowers, and so on. So plurality, the plurality method only takes into account the number of first choice votes. So this is just the first choice counts for each candidate. Calderon has 320 first choice votes. Shahab has 330 first choice votes. Right? And we look down the row in first choice. There aren't any other Shahab or Calderon columns. Bowers has 2 first choice columns, right? So 175 voters ranked Bowers first in this column, and then 175 voters ranked Bowers first in this column, right? Again, the difference between these two is their rankings of Shahab and Calderon. So it looks like Bowers has 175 plus 175 total first place rankings. So Bowers has 350 votes total. That beats Calderon and Shahab's 320 and 330 respectively. So in the plurality method, Bowers wins the election. So Bowers wins the election in this situation for plurality. But notice I didn't take into account second and third choice. So there wasn't really much of a purpose of having a ranked ballot in this case. So this would just be the normal elections that we have, the usual, vote for one of the lesser evils, right? As a lot of people like to say. So the single runoff situation is the following. The single runoff says take the top 2 candidates by first choice votes. Okay, so the top 2 candidates, the candidates with the most first choice votes. Well, remember we have all those listed here, so we can use that information. Bowers has 350, Shahab has 330, and Calderon has 320. Clearly, Bowers and Shahab have the most voters, most first choice voters, and they're the top 2 candidates with first choice voters. Okay, or with top 2 candidates with first choice votes. So what we do then is we take any votes where Calderon was ranked first. If we had another column of that, we could do that as well. But any rankings where Calderon is first, we're going to divvy up those votes to whoever the second choice is in this column, right? Now, in this column, the second choice is Shahab. So these 320 voters that preferred Calderon first, now that Calderon is no longer viable, being the weakest of the 3 candidates in first choice votes, these 320 votes go to Shahab, these voters' second choice. So we add that to Shahab's total. And after that, we'll just have Shahab versus Bowers left. And there's no other Calderon votes to split up. So Shahab has 330 plus 320 is 650 votes. And in the single runoff, Shahab beats Bowers by 650 to 350 votes. Shahab wins this election. When we take that second choice into account, it really starts to demonstrate that, and when we look at this, it seems like a lot more people prefer Shahab to Bowers, even if Shahab was their second choice. So we could see where the plurality method could be pretty disappointing to a general population. It seems like not a lot of people wanted Bowers as their official, and that's really pretty clear thanks to this second choice ranking scenario. But again, this is not the only way to determine this election. The other thing we could do is the sequential runoff. So this is yet another way to decide this. Now, in this case, the sequential runoff, when there are 3 candidates, turns out to be the same as the single runoff, because in the sequential runoff, you eliminate the candidate with the least first choice votes. Well, when we do that, we realize that Calderon, again, has the least number of first choice votes at 320. So Calderon is eliminated, and then we divvy up Calderon's votes among the remaining candidates. Well, when we do that, there are only 2 candidates left, Shahab and Bowers. And just like last time, once Calderon's no longer viable, the second choice of these voters, Shihab, those 320 votes go to Shihab's total. And we again see it's the same results as before. It's the same as above, and Shihab wins this in the sequential runoff. So when you only have 3 candidates, a single runoff is the same as a sequential runoff. But the difference would be there would be a difference if we had 4 candidates, right? If we had a 4th candidate that we were ranking on this ballot and then had these results in front of us, then we would eliminate the weakest of the 4, the one with the least number of first choice votes, and then we would divvy their votes according to the second choice preferences, and then we would consider the remaining 3 candidates. And then we would look who has the most preferences in the remaining 3 candidates, and then we'd remove the weakest candidate of those 3, and we'd be down to the last 2. When we remove the weakest of the 3 candidates, we would again divvy the votes by second and third choices, and those votes would go to the remaining 2, and we'd decide who wins the election from there. So in this case, they're just the same situation. But it takes it's a bit tedious to do a sequential runoff for 4 candidates. We have to, it's quite a bit of work, and the book I think does have at least one example of that. The fourth way we could do this is a point system. So in the point system, what we do is we'll say the candidate, every first choice ranking counts as 2 points. Every second place ranking counts as 1 point, and every third place ranking counts as 0 points. And then what we'll do is we'll total up the points that each candidate won. So Calderon has 320 times 2 first place rankings. Then Calderon has 330 times 1 point for second choice rankings, so 330 of those. And then 175 more second choice rankings with 1 point. And then 175 third place rankings, but third place rankings count for 0, so there's nothing to add here. So we add up all these numbers, and by points, Calderon has 1,145 points. And again, we'll do this for each candidate. The candidate with the most points is going to win this election. So Shihab has 330 first place votes, so that's 330 times 2 points. And then second place over here, so 320 times 1 point. And then second place here, so 175 times 1 point. And when we add up all those points, Shihab has 1,155 points. And we'll do the same finally for Bowers. Bowers has 2 times 175 and 2 times 175 for both of Bowers' first place rankings. But that's all that Bowers gets. Bowers is ranked 3rd in both these preferences. So Bowers gets 0 points for both of those. So it's just the 2 times 175 and 2 times 175. That's a total of 700 votes for Bowers. So again, we compare the total points of each candidate, and Shihab beats Calderon by about 10 points, interestingly enough. So it really looks like plurality could have led us to the wrong place, and we use plurality in lots of our elections still in the country. So, plurality led Bowers to win in this situation, but it really turned out in these other methods, Shihab seems to be the more preferred candidate. Now, the last situation is pairwise comparisons. So this is where we go through and we pit each candidate against the other. So first, Calderon versus Shihab. Okay, well, what we need to look at is how many different preference schedules does Calderon win versus Shihab? So let's look back at the top, Calderon versus Shihab. So Calderon beats Shihab in this race, and Calderon beats Shihab in this race. So Calderon has 320 plus 175 votes in favor of them over Shihab. So we'll write that in down here, 320 plus 175. Calderon has 495 votes preferring them over Shihab. Now we have to go back through and count the number of votes Shihab has over Calderon. So we look for every column that has Calderon or Shihab over Calderon, and that's these. So we have 330 plus 175. And in this case, we'll add 330 and 175 together, and we'll get 505. So in this race, it looks like Shahab's 505 beats Calderon's 495. So in a 1-to-1 pairwise race, Shahab beats Calderon. Next up, Calderon versus Bowers. We have to do this for every possible pair. Now, if we had 4 candidates, we'd have, I believe, 6 different pairwise races to consider, and that's a lot of work to do by hand. So this is why we only have 3 here. Since we have 3 candidates, we have to do 3 different pairwise races. So Calderon versus Bowers. Calderon beats Bowers here, and Calderon beats Bowers in this column. So Calderon has 320 plus 330. That's 650 total votes in favor here. And then Bowers beats Calderon here and here for 175 plus 175 is 350 votes for Bowers versus Calderon. And then we compare those votes. Calderon has 650 votes over Bowers, whereas Bowers has 350 over Calderon. So Calderon is preferred to Bowers, and Calderon wins that pairwise election. Lastly, Shahab versus Bowers. So Shahab versus Bowers, we go through here and here. Shahab beats Bowers, and Shahab beats Bowers in this race. So Shahab gets 320 plus 330. On the other hand, Bowers beats Shahab in these 2 races, and these 2 rankings. And we add 175 and 175 for Bowers' votes against Shahab. And when we put all those together, we see that Shahab has 650 votes favoring them versus Bowers, whereas Bowers has 350 favoring them versus Shahab. Shahab beats Bowers. And when we look through the total of these 3 pairwise elections, we see Shahab beats Calderon, Shahab beats Bowers, nobody beats Shahab, so Shahab wins the election. And that's it. Calderon beats Bowers, but that's irrelevant because Shahab beat Calderon and Bowers. So the candidate that wins the most the most number of pairwise races like this is the one that wins. In this case, Shahab won 2 pairwise races, and everybody else won 1 or fewer. So those are our voting methods, right? Remember, again, just to kind of reiterate what was happening here, these are the results from a ranked choice voting format, right? In this situation, this means that 320 voters said they prefer Calderon as number 1, Shahab as number 2, and Bowers as number 3. So one of the things that ranked choice voting allows us to do is it allows us to say, maybe Calderon was a third-party candidate, a non-major party candidate that we really supported and really liked. But we know that Shahab and Bowers, who are the 2 major political party candidates, are most likely going to be, one of the 2 winners in this situation. What it allows us to do is still vote viably for Calderon, just to be able to try to elect somebody different, right? Somebody that we really think will represent us in the best way, rather than being generic major party candidates. If Calderon doesn't make it, clearly, and if this was one of my, ranked ballot, if this is my ranked ballot right here, well, then I know that once Calderon is not viable, then I can support the major party candidate that I've, dislike the least, or the one that I like more. And that way, this sort of overcomes what's called the spoiler effect, right? If Calderon and Shahab are similarly aligned, well, then Calderon could spoil Shahab's chances in the election because Calderon might draw voters away from Shahab. And then both voters for these 2 candidates would be disappointed because that could cause Bowers to win. And, they didn't support Bowers in the first place. So these are some of the benefits to ranked choice voting. What's interesting is there are so many different ways to total these things up. I think most of the time, so a lot of states are adopting ranked choice voting, and I think they're using sequential runoff in order to determine the winner of ranked choice voting elections. So that's an interesting fact for modern times. In the next section, we'll talk about fairness of voting systems. And then lastly, we'll talk about districting and representation for voters within districts.